Good evening, Angela, and welcome to this episode here of the Watchdog. I am your host, CJ Cox, and of course, I do appreciate you guys for joining this conversation here with me. We got a lot of very interesting news to be talking about, and of course, it will have a lot to do with the recent protests all across the country and indeed the world. And real quickly, let's just go ahead and jump right into our pre-article discussion and describe what I am talking about. For those who have been living under a rock for the last week, on May 26th, 2020, an African-American man by the name of George Floyd was murdered by Derek Chauvin, a Minneapolis PD officer. The officer was putting his knee on the man Floyd's neck, and Floyd apparently died of an asphyxiation, right? Not being able to breathe. He told the officer numerous times he was not able to breathe. This was all caught on video, and of course he did end up dying. He was actually on Chauvin, was actually on Floyd for roughly 8.5 minutes. For roughly 2.5 of those minutes, Floyd was completely unconscious and unresponsive, and indeed even one of the officers ended up eventually speaking up and saying, hey, you need to get off him, he's unresponsive, right? So was definitely a clear instance of police brutality, and of course a lot of people were very outraged by it. Now the next day, May 27th, all 4 police officers were fired, and on May 29th, Officer Chauvin was actually arrested and charged with third-degree murder. So we are going to end up seeing him go to court for this, and of course, hopefully we will see him found guilty. It does appear that there's definitely enough evidence for him to be found guilty and prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. And actually, I think I said he died on the 26th. I believe it was actually the 25th, if I'm not mistaken, because I think the 26th is actually when protests started. And at that time, they were actually relatively peaceful. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, I do believe that the first people to fire at all were actually Minneapolis riot police, who had fired tear gas and things like that into what were actually primarily peaceful crowds. Of course, they had a lot to do with groups that a lot of us may disagree with, like Black Lives Matter and things like that, and I'll get to more about my position on them in a moment. But they were primarily peaceful at first, and they were actually gassed, had those little smoke canisters shot at them and so on and so forth. And there was even reports of stores like Target actually refusing to give protesters things like milk, to sell them things like milk and stuff like that, so that they could put out the burn that a lot of the tear gas causes in your eyes there, right? So that ended up happening, of course, a very horrible reaction by the Minneapolis police. And then eventually the protest ended up escalating to violence, right? Now the violence does seem to have an element of control and also an element of chaos and anarchy to it. And let me explain kind of what I mean by that. This violence ended up spreading all across the country. I'm sure a lot of you already know this, right? And in a lot of instances, it seemed very senseless, right? People kind of looting any old random store, dragging people out of cars. A young man in Dallas who was defending a local shop ended up getting beaten, stoned basically, by a group of some 20 to 30 rioters, right? And so on and so forth. So a lot of this seemed to be random thuggery and pure violence, right? But also a lot of it seemed to be very controlled. A lot of rioters ended up actually storming, for example, City Hall in Reno, the third precinct police station in Minneapolis was burned down. There was people who were actually going after the White House in Washington, D.C. CNN headquarters was stormed, right? And that certainly seemed a little bit more controlled, like people who actually had an end goal and a stated target to attack, right? So, and of course, like I said, there was already people who were being peaceful. So certainly to lump all of that, and that's the first thing I want to actually point out in this discussion, to lump all of the protesters into the same group is not accurate, right? There are Antifa protesters versus Black Lives Matter protesters versus protesters who are kind of just generally not okay with police brutality or the murder of George Floyd or what they see as systemic racism. There's violent people, there's looters, there's people who are kind of controlled with their violence, right, and so on and so forth. And that kind of brings me to the crux of what I'm trying to talk about here today, which is that these riots are a lot more complicated than people are giving them credit for. And this is something that human beings do constantly. We never, ever actually properly discuss and understand the nuance of human violence and why and when we commit atrocious acts against each other and end up indeed splitting on ideological, racial, religious, whatever it happens to be, lines. I've said numerous times on the show, and I'll say again, I do expect a civil war to occur in the very near future. I didn't know that it would be something this quick, but I certainly do see this as potentially something that could lead to that, especially with the reactions of a lot of states sending in the National Guard and militarized police, and Trump even threatening to send in the military, which of course we'll talk about. And I think, you see this constantly in the past when we look at, history and stuff like that, where it's just like, the American revolutionaries were heroic patriots, and that's just the end of the conversation. And the redcoats, were oppressive tyrants and scum, and that's also the end of the conversation. When in reality, of course, and I do take the side of the American Revolution, of course. I love the United States Constitution, right? But in reality, it was much more complicated than that. You could argue that George Washington was a traitor because he was a member of the British Army and indeed an aristocrat born into a relatively unwealthy family, but married into a quite prestigious family for the, as far as the aristocracy of Virginia was concerned. Right? And you could certainly consider him to be, from the British perspective, no better than Benedict Arnold. On the same token of that, right, Samuel Adams was a serious provocateur who got innocent people hurt, like very hurt, like tarred and feathered and dragged throughout the streets, right? And at the same time, of course, there was the British people did use Native American tribes to kind of, as sort of a proxy to slaughter villages of colonials, right, during this time. And that way we would actually get mad at the natives rather than getting mad at the British for what were certainly absolutely atrocious war crimes and so on and so forth, right? And when you understand all of those different historical points, you start to realize the American Revolution was a lot more complicated than just taxation without representation, we want freedom, and the great tyrant King George, yada yada. Same thing if you look at the American Civil War, right? In a word, could you say the Civil War was about slavery? Absolutely. Would it also be accurate to say the Civil War was about states' rights? Absolutely. Would it also be accurate to say it was about a fear of the lack of your lifestyle, or of the destruction, rather, of your lifestyle and collapse of your economy? Absolutely. Would it also be safe to say that it was about the preservation of the Union? Absolutely. Would it also be safe to say, right, that it was kind of about a certain amount of freedom, right? And in fact, a lot of people tend to forget 4 of the 11 states that seceded not because of slavery, but because the United States decided to invade the 7 states that did secede because of slavery, and they thought it was wrong to invade your fellow American states, right? And those were, I believe, Virginia is definitely one of them. It's harder for me to remember the rest of them because they don't, usually come up as much when you're studying Civil War history. But I believe they were Arkansas and Tennessee. And it may have even been Florida, but I guess I'm not 100% sure. Somebody fact-check me on those other 3, but Virginia was definitely one of them. Nonetheless, that leads you to, once again, understand it's a lot more complicated than that. The average Confederate soldier, even the Confederate officer a lot of times, was not fighting to keep the black man down any more than the Union officer was fighting to free them, even though the war, in a word, was certainly about slavery. And you see the same thing, of course, if you move on to World War I and World War II and so on and so forth, right? History is complicated. War is complicated. Violence is complicated. The justifications, both ideologically and philosophically, for violence and for committing certain atrocious acts against your fellow human beings is incredibly complicated. And we don't do our nation, which is struggling right now, any favors by oversimplifying it and preaching these mantras. And I'm going to give you a few examples of things that are simultaneously true, that people are kind of taking as this, one or the other sort of thing. For example, thing number 1, there is a police brutality problem in this country. There has been a police brutality problem in this country for a long time. There once was a time, roughly 2012 to 2015 era, that conservatives, a lot of conservatives on the quote-unquote far right, like Tea Party and people like that, acknowledge this pretty frequently. People like Alex Jones, Drudge Report, Breitbart, Ron Paul. Rand Paul to this day thankfully still does, although Rand Paul is not nearly the libertarian his father was. The Constitution Party would frequently address this. The Libertarian Party would frequently address this. There used to be a time when a lot of people frequently addressed the fact that there was a lot of government overreach, the police were being over-militarized, and absolutely the police were being expected, or were not being expected, rather, to take any sort of care with their job as the enforcer of the law, and indeed, in a sense, the moral enforcer, right? Because that is what are laws, if not moral proclamations of what you shall and shall not do, right? and yet they were allowed to get away with everything. And people used to talk about this frequently. All of a sudden, Donald Trump got elected, and Black Lives Matter came out as a protest in Ferguson 2015, and people kind of decided you're either pro-cop or pro-Black Lives Matter as if that was the only option. And all of a sudden, a lot of conservatives stopped talking about the fact that there absolutely is a police brutality issue in the United States of America. Nearly 1,000 people are killed by police every single year in the United States of America. And of course, a lot of those are justified, but a lot of them are not, right? Another thing that is true is that systemic racism is not really a thing in the United States anymore. It certainly was at a point in time. It is not now, right? The vast majority of white people are not racist. The majority of people who are killed by police are indeed white. And in fact, if you actually statistically look at, the numbers of people who are getting in violent altercations with police or are getting in altercations with police over violent crimes, rather, 3 out of every 100,000, if they're black, will end up being killed by the cop, whereas 4 out of every 100,000, if they're white, will end up being killed by the cop. Roughly 2 times, if not over 2 times, depending on the year, more white people end up being killed by cops than black people every single year, right? And of course, the numbers with Latinos are very similar to the numbers with black people as well. There's also a lot of people who are unidentified, and of course, Native Americans, Arabs, Jews, Asians, lots of different colors and creeds, of American are killed by cop every single year. Why is that? It's because the first truth, we do have a police brutality problem here, and we have multiple problems that go into it. We have a police state problem. We have a militarization of the police problem. We have a constitutional crisis where people do not respect the Bill of Rights in any way, shape, or form. We certainly have an elite class, mostly made up of liberals. I'd just like to point out, most of the billionaires, celebrities, and political class, as well as the media, are certainly liberals. But nonetheless, we have an elite class that wishes to keep people of certain political and religious and ideological sects down, that wishes to keep people of a certain economic class down, so on and so forth. We absolutely do have a problem with the accountability police officers are expected to have for the crimes they commit, and so on and so forth, right? And so there's a lot of problems we do definitely have. Racism is not really one of them anymore, right? Certainly there are people who are racist, but honestly, I would argue that the more racism you're seeing, or the most racism you're seeing these days, rather, is actually on the part of people like Black Lives Matter and etc. And that brings me to the third thing, which is indeed a truth. Black Lives Matter is a black supremacist organization. They are racists, and there is numerous ways you can prove that. One of the most obvious ways to prove that is the fact that they claim religiously, constantly, America is an oppressive system and white people need to pay their reparations and pay their dues and bow to us and all this other kind of nonsense, right? Because they did all these evil things over 150 years ago. When, of course, that was a limited number of white people in a certain area of the country at a certain point in time, which is not even the point, by the way. The bigger point is that that actually operates as a mechanism to diminish your personal, your organizational credit, right? Because if you have somebody like me who actually does believe in the Constitution and in very many instances agrees that the police officers are going out of their way to murder people, right? You're going to turn me off immediately when you start claiming that just because I have a certain color of skin, I can't possibly know your struggle and also am to blame for your struggle, right? Because that's just simply not the case. Now you have us being fractured and the government gets to go off doing whatever it is that they wish to be doing, right? And on top of that, you started it because you're the one sitting here ignoring people like Duncan Lemp, ignoring people like Danny Schaefer, ignoring people like Tony Timpa, and so on and so forth, people who were murdered by police officers but happen to be white, and so you don't see them all over the news, and so you don't think that that sort of stuff is happening. No, police brutality only happens to you, right? It's actually very self-centered, egotistical, and arrogant, whereas on the flip side, I'm sitting here saying, yes, it does happen to white people. It also absolutely happens to black people, and it absolutely happens to Latino people because there is a police brutality problem here. And that, in there lies the biggest example of racism. And in fact, I want to show you guys something. You probably didn't recognize a lot of those names that I had just mentioned. But let me show you this here. Just the quick Wikipedia article. You guys will obviously be able to see this, as well as the video of this absolutely egregious shooting in the description below. So, Daniel Shaver, January 18th, 2016. Daniel Leighton Shaver of Granbury, Texas. there's his little mug right there, obviously a white guy, were shot dead by police officer Philip Brailsford in the hallway of a La Quinta Inn and Suites Hotel in Mesa, Arizona. Police were responding to a report that a rifle had been brandished at the window of Schaefer's hotel room. After the shooting, the rifle, which remained in the room, was determined to be a pellet gun. You heard that correctly. He was murdered over a pellet gun, even though you have the right to actually have rifles, period, let alone a pellet gun. Following an investigation, Brailsford was charged with second-degree murder and a lesser manslaughter charge and found not guilty by a jury. Prosecutors argued the shooting was unjustified. In March 2018, it became known that the United States Department of Justice had reopened the case and was looking into a possible civil rights violation by Brailsford. Brailsford was then reinstated. Listen to this, reinstated by the Mesa Police Department in August 2018, and then over a month later was granted retirement on medical grounds as well as a pension of $2,500 of taxpayer money per month. And of course, he has this little sob story about how his outright murder of a man crying, crawling, and begging for his life because this Brailsford douche had stupid and confusing commands, right, that he was giving out to Schaefer. So he ends up using it as an excuse to shoot Schaefer, who's begging for his life, right? And this man gets $2,500 a month of your taxpayer money and gets reinstated, gets to retire, all that noise. But where are the protests for that? Where are the police brutality, people calling out police brutality, over that instance, right? Any sort of a White Lives Matter riots, protest, any of that sort of thing. Of course, none of it exists. And you see this happening all the time, such as with Kelly Thomas, such as with the Dallas couple. I forget their name, who was murdered in Dallas in a no-knock raid. You had Tony Tippa, who actually called the police so that they would assist him. And of course, what do they end up doing? They end up murdering him. Dennis Tuttle and Regina Nicholas was the name of the Dallas couple who was murdered in a no-knock raid for drug crimes that they, of course, did not even end up committing because the police are completely useless and inept in absolutely everything that they do. So you see instances like this, right? And it tells you very plainly this is not a race issue, and yet you insist that I am oppressing you personally because of my white skin. That is racism, and Black Lives Matter is indeed a racist organization. Fourth simultaneous truth in this situation, violence is indeed sometimes justified. Absolutely. If you were in the vicinity of the Daniel Schaefer murder or the George Floyd murder, and you had a firearm and you saw the police doing that and you responded by killing the police officers, you are completely justified. Furthermore, I am not going to criticize Minneapolis protesters for storming the Minneapolis 3rd Precinct and burning it to the ground. Quite frankly, this country was founded in violence. I'm not necessarily in the business of condemning or endorsing when it comes to that because it's an incredibly complex issue. I just like to explain what I see as the sides. But I'm certainly not going to condemn them for that. That is controlled. There's a stated goal. There's an enemy there, somebody who they're actually trying to go for, right? That they see as causing these problems. And I'm not going to condemn that because I think that that is a legitimate form of violent protest, if I'm being completely honest with you. And I've always thought that. It doesn't matter if it's America Hana or George Washington or Malcolm X, right? It really doesn't matter. At that point, you're at least being controlled. I may disagree with you. And of course, if I disagree with the reasons you're committing violence, then I'm obviously going to oppose you in that. And that's something that people need to remember about violence, but we'll get to that in a second. That being said, though, I'm not going to condemn the violence in and of itself. I understand what you're doing. I understand your target, all that other kind of stuff. On the flip side, though, senseless violence is exactly that. It's senseless. There was no reason to burn down an AutoZone. There was no reason to potentially kill the kid in Dallas who was defending a business with a sword. There was no reason to attack the elderly couple who was defending their jewelry store. There was no reason to pull people out of their trucks and crowbar their cars and things like that, right? This is senseless violence against citizens for absolutely no reason. A lot of times it's on racial grounds. A lot of times it's not even strictly to white people, right? A lot of times they're actually attacking, for example, a black police chief who was retired, 77 years old, was actually murdered, I believe, in, can't remember where exactly he was. There's so many different stories going around here. I'm kind of being a little bit forgetful on the names, right? And there's a few other people who have died, actually. I unfortunately don't have many of the names. I can't remember the name. It'll come to me at a random time. I know it. But nonetheless, right, people who are, of course, even of the same skin color who are being killed. So clearly, even sometimes it's not racist. But it is senseless. It's just senseless violence constantly. It's more akin to the French Revolution than the United States Revolution, right? And that, I think, is definitely condemnable. And that's another simultaneous truth with this. Yes, violence is justified in many instances. Violence that is uncontrolled, chaotic, and strikes out at everybody is absolutely not on that understandable, justifiable violence pedestal that a lot of other violent actions can actually be, right? And I do want to personally make that distinction that as somebody who does believe that, violent revolutions are legitimate, and I'm not endorsing a violent revolution, by the way, but we do need to understand the United States of America was founded in a violent revolution, right? The Native Americans defended themselves in a violent revolution. That slaves defended themselves in a violent revolution. We all agree violent revolution is justified at certain point in times. So we need to sit down and have a legitimate discussion about what makes certain violence and certain revolutions justifiable and certain violence and certain revolutions not justifiable. The reason these ones right now are not justifiable outside of those certain instances of controlled and pointed violence at a precinct or at a CNN location or at a city hall or something like that, which even though I don't necessarily agree with because of ideological reasons, I can't necessarily condemn on strictly the grounds of being violent because it's controlled, it has purpose, right? But that other violence that goes out and goes into the suburbs and breaks into homes and loots and beats people up for no reason and potentially kills them and breaks into their cars and all that other kind of stuff, that is senseless mob rule and absolutely needs to be condemned. It is not a revolution at that point. It is a riot. There is a difference between a revolution and a riot. Riots are pointless. They're just people destroying for destruction's sake. Revolutions have a goal, and of course, at that point, you need to start discussing the political ideologies that are entailed in that goal, right? And I think that is the other thing that we definitely need to address here. Like I said, and this goes back to that idea of Black Lives Matter being a black supremacist organization. I cannot in good conscience support these protesters if they are going to try and overthrow things like the Constitution in favor for slavery reparations and Marxism. Just simply can't do that. If they're not willing to admit that we are equal as human beings, right? If they're going to be the racist one, well, I'm a white person. I simply can't do that. And I'm not going to bow and grovel because my ancestors may or may not have committed egregious acts against your ancestors. A lot of people have committed egregious acts against my ancestors, right? You don't hear me saying nothing about that, and I shouldn't be saying anything about that, and neither should you, right? We live in the United States of America that's supposed to be the great melting pot with the United States Constitution, a civic nationalism, and so on and so forth. So let's move forward with that idea. And if we do need to get violent to preserve that idea, so be it. But if we're going to get violent to try and overthrow that idea, then I absolutely positively disagree, regardless of what actually set it off to begin with, right? And that is something that definitely needs to be noted. If fascists and Nazis decided that the murder of Duncan Lemp was their hill to die on, so to speak, and that's why they ended up rioting and trying to overthrow the United States government. Even though I agree the murder of Duncan Lemp was unjust and incredibly evil, I could not support those groups because I don't support Nazis. And the same applies here, right? I cannot support Marxist groups. I cannot support black supremacist groups. And so, to recap, what is it that I'm trying to say here? I think violence is justified sometimes. I don't think riots are justified. I also don't believe in the Black Lives Matter ideology that assumes white guilt and also assumes that black people can't be racist, that they're not black supremacists, that police brutality is only a black problem, so on and so forth. I also recognize the government oversteps its bounds constantly. There is a police brutality problem in this country. There are multiple people. I listed all the names of those white people. Let's just list some of the black names now for the point of extending the olive branch, right? We know George Floyd died. Breonna Thomas was murdered. Obviously, we saw back in the day Shamir Rice, right, being murdered, a 12-year-old kid, right, being murdered, and so on and so forth. There is a police brutality problem in this issue. There is a government overreach in this nation. There's a police brutality problem in this nation. There is a government overreach problem in this nation. There is a problem with militarization of the police in this nation. There's a problem with lack of accountability in the police departments in this nation. It does not involve racism. Okay? White people and black people, for the most part, if you're talking about the citizenry, are not racist. Groups like Black Lives Matter and the Democratic Party and the Republican Party and Fox News and CNN, etc., they want you to be racist But the thing is, most people these days are not. And you need to keep it that way. Otherwise, things will get a lot more violent than you want them to get. And that's not a threat. That is a promise from the point of view of understanding history. I'm not saying I'm personally going to do something. I am saying I am somebody who has read a lot of history books. And anybody who has read a lot of history books can tell you these things don't end well. They actually end incredibly brutally. In fact, you didn't even have to go that far back in history to look at the Syrian Civil War and how absolutely heinous that actually was. Groups like ISIS and the Free Syrian Army and etc. and everything that they ended up causing down there, Al-Qaeda getting involved, Al-Nusra getting involved, etc. It was horrible, horrifying, and it's still going on to this day. And by the way, it ended up, much like now, being a fight between two parties that were evil. ISIS is evil and Assad is evil. They are both evil. And it was evil versus evil, and the good citizens of Syria caught in the middle of two evil people trying to kill each other, and all of the other side groups trying to make some sort of sense out of this with whatever their political ideology happened to be, whether it was protecting the Yazidis or Kurdish nationalism or Aramaic nationalism or just trying to protect your local village, for crying out loud, right? So on and so forth. The Free Syrian Army obviously trying to establish some sort of a new democracy. That's what ends up happening in a lot of these situations. And it's horrifying, of course. And of course, if we end up seeing the radical left wing and the United States government fighting each other now, that's the exact same situation. Your radical left wing, Antifa, being your rebellion that is just absolutely insane, such as ISIS, and your United States government that caused the problem in the first place with police brutality, with police state overreach, and so on and so forth, being your Assad, right? And I definitely fear that we're getting close to something like that. But to recap, there is a police brutality issue. It does not have to do with systematic racism, but affects the races basically equally. Black Lives Matter is a white supremacist organization, or a black supremacist rather organization. You cannot support violence if the violence is uncontrolled, but violence can definitely be the answer if it is controlled. And also, it doesn't make any sense to support violence that is in line with an ideology you disagree with. And of course, that's just the nature of ideologies in the first place. You won't support peaceful protests that are, against your particular ideology. Hopefully, of course, you still support their right to do those peaceful protests, because if you don't, I very much question your so-called conservatism. But that doesn't mean you have to agree with the protests themselves, right? And so that was my little, 27-minute rant on the, 27 minutes, it's kind of ridiculous, on the riots that we have currently had so far. And so I want to go ahead and talk about a few other things. Now, Roberts embraced his role as Supreme Court swing justice with latest church ruling. Now, to recap on this, of course, people were shutting down numerous things, including but not limited to churches, for the coronavirus pandemic. All these states had their stay-at-home orders and lockdowns and what have you. And, of course, a lot of churches said you're not allowed to do this and decided they were not going to shut down. One of the more famous incidents, at least amongst people who would watch this show and or Unapologetics, would be Tony Spell in Louisiana, because we had been reporting on him basically all the time. But of course, there was other people who reported on, like Rodney Howard-Browne and Tim Remington and so on. And in California, there was actually a group that decided to sue and go all the way to the Supreme Court. And of course, Rodney Howard-Browne decided to do that also. Well, they went to the Supreme Court to see, does the United States government actually have the right to shut down places of worship? And the United States Supreme Court, because it's completely useless, voted yes. So let's go ahead and read this article from Ron Blitzer of FoxNews.com. Roberts embraced his role as Supreme Court swing justice with latest church ruling. This will be fun. Supreme Court Chief Justice John Roberts continues to position himself as the High Court's swing vote, siding with both his conservative and liberal colleagues in close decisions, including recently in cases related to the coronavirus lockdown. The latest instance of this came days ago when the court rejected an emergency appeal by a California church that challenged state limits on attendance at religious services. That role was previously held by the now retired Justice Anthony Kennedy, whose seat was filled by President Trump's conservative pick, Justice Brett Kavanaugh. While each of the conservatives were known to side with the liberal wing of, it's kind of just jumped up. While each of the conservatives were known to side with the liberal wing of the court from time to time, last year, Roberts' role in key decisions has him viewed as a wild card. Quote, the Chief Justice has clearly inherited the mantle of the swing role from Anthony Kennedy, end quote, Judicial Crisis Network spokesperson Gail Trotter told Fox News. Quote, over time, he has been unpredictable, end quote. Perhaps the most notorious of Roberts' votes has been when he sided with liberal justices, in a 5-4 decision, authoring the court's opinion that upheld the Affordable Care Act in 2012. It was Roberts who wrote that individual mandate was legal because having a monetary penalty attached allowed it to fall under Congress's taxation powers. More recently, Roberts authored a 5-4 decision last year where he led conservative justices in a controversial ruling where the court said it was not their role to get involved in the partisan gerrymandering claims. And so you see he's definitely been kind of, as they're saying, a wild card, right? A little bit flip-floppy, but of course, you're not necessarily supposed to be ideologically partisan as the Chief Justice or really a justice at all. So one could argue that that's definitely a good thing, but we move on. According to statistics compiled by SCOTUS blog, the court's October 2018 term featured 17 cases that resulted in 5-4 decisions where all 4 liberal justices voted together. Of these, Roberts turned out to be a deciding vote in 10 of them, sticking with his fellow conservatives 7 times and voting with liberal justices 3 times. As it turns out, Justice Neil Gorsuch, who is often viewed as more traditionally conservative, sided with the liberal contingent in 4 of those 5-4 decisions. So far, in the court's current term, there has been 4 5-4 decisions with conservatives in the majority for all of them. Roberts could play a role in another key case that was heard this term, one that involves a Louisiana abortion law that requires doctors who perform abortions to have admitting privileges at a nearby hospital. When the Supreme Court blocked a similar law in Texas with a 5-4 ruling, Roberts and other conservatives were in the minority, with Kennedy being the swing vote for the liberals. When a request for a temporary injunction against the Louisiana law came before the court last year, Roberts sided with liberals in a 5-4 ruling that blocked the law for the duration of the case. Time will tell which way Roberts leans in deciding the case on the merits. Oral arguments in the case took place in March, and Roberts appeared to wonder if the Louisiana case could be distinguished from the Texas one. The Texas law was struck down for placing an undue burden on women seeking abortions because it would have left few facilities remaining in the state, but Roberts and Kavanaugh both questioned whether that would necessarily be the case everywhere. They asked during oral arguments if Louisiana's law could be an undue burden, if few or any doctors would have problems admitting privileges. Roberts suggested that while Texas's law was found to be problematic, given the facts in the case, other states may have different standards that might be constitutional. So you see he's definitely been a swing voter in a lot of different instances here. In this particular instance, of course, like we were saying, he has actually decided he is going to align himself with everybody basically who was saying that it is okay for you to shut down churches in times of a public emergency. And I'm actually going to click this other article here so that we can get you guys a little bit more details on that. But of course, one of the big reasons I wanted to point out everything with what Justice Roberts has kind of become here is because a lot of people were thinking, well, yeah, we have Donald Trump, Gorsuch, and Kavanaugh now, and everything's going to go swimmingly. And on top of the fact that Gorsuch, and Kavanaugh are not actually as conservative as people think, as we've seen here, Justice Roberts is not as conservative as people think. Right? Dumb ad here playing. My apologies. At any rate, though, let's get a little bit further into the case itself. This is from Mark Sherman. It's actually coming originally from Associated Press, but it is via Fox News. A divided Supreme Court on Friday rejected an emergency appeal by a California church that challenged state limits on attendance at worship services that have been imposed to contain the spread of the coronavirus. And this is why it is very important for people to understand that Gorsuch and Kavanaugh, in this case Justice Roberts, are not as conservative as they had originally thought, right? We are not out of the woodworks, as they say, when it comes to a lot of these issues where we fear our rights are being trampled upon. Over the dissent of the 4 more conservative justices, Chief Justice John Roberts joined the joined the court's 4 liberals in turning away a request from the South Bay United Pentecostal Church in Chula Vista, California, in the San Diego area. The church argued that limits on how many people can attend their services violate constitutional guarantees of religious freedom and had been seeking an order in time for services on Sunday. The church said it has crowds of 200 to 300 people for its services. Roberts wrote in a brief opinion that the restriction allowing churches to reopen at 25% of their capacity with no more than 100 worshipers at a time appears consistent with the First Amendment. I don't know what First Amendment he's reading, but okay. Roberts had similar or more severe limits apply to concerts, movies, and sporting events where large groups of people gather in close proximity for extended periods of time. And of course, the big problem with this is that there is indeed a right to assemble. There isn't necessarily a right to assemble in a concert or in a movie theater or in a sporting event. Now I do think that those are arguments that need to be had in and of themselves, right? But so long as you're still allowed to assemble in the way that was actually intended, which was assembling for protest and family meetings and things like that, I think you could make arguments, of course, that First Amendment right to assemble certainly applies to movie theaters and things like that. But there is actually an explicit First Amendment right to religious practice as well, whereas there is not an explicit First Amendment right to go to the movie theater or to a bar or etc., even though, like I said, that's an argument we could have and really should be having, just unfortunately at a later date because we're short on time. So even if we grant complete legitimacy to the government-mandated shutdown of concerts, movies, sporting events, and etc., that still would not grant legitimacy to the government-mandated shutdown of churches because churches are explicitly guaranteed their right to religious practice in the First Amendment of the United States Constitution. If you don't see that, you're simply lying or delusional. Okay, that is the only way that we can actually put it. The United States government, the state governments of the United States, the city governments in each of those states, the county governments in each of those states, etc., do not have the right to tell you you cannot meet in your church, in your temple, in your mosque, in your cathedral, in your synagogue, whatever it happens to be. They simply do not have the right. And it very much baffles me that the Supreme Court, again, consistently, they always do this, again, they biff it on basic freedoms. They biffed it on freedoms in the womb in 1973. They biffed it on the freedom of the Japanese person to stay outside of internment just because he was Japanese in 1944. They biffed it in the 1920s on the right of the mentally handicapped person to actually live instead of being euthanized. They biff it constantly. And this idea that the Supreme Court is the ultimate arbiter of truth, right? Whilst that certainly may be how the system works, it's not how reality works. It's still wrong to abort babies even though the Supreme Court doesn't think so. It's still wrong to let rapists live even though the Supreme Court doesn't think so. It's still wrong to shut down churches on the government mandate even though the Supreme Court doesn't think so. And I can continue so on and so forth, right? The Supreme Court is wrong all the time. Justice Brett Kavanaugh wrote in dissent, by the way. I know I talk a lot of shade on Mr. Brett Kavanaugh, but let's give credit where credit is due. He voted right here. He voted exactly where we want him to, so thank you, Justice Kavanaugh. Justice Brett Kavanaugh wrote in dissent that the restriction, quote, discriminates against places of worship and in favor of comparable secular businesses. Such discriminations violates the First Amendment, end quote. Kavanaugh pointed to supermarkets, restaurants, hair salons, cannabis dispensaries, and other businesses that are not subject to the same restrictions. And I would, of course, point out in a lot of instances this includes but is not limited to strip clubs, bars, abortion clinics, and so on and so forth. The court also rejected an appeal from 2 churches in the Chicago area that objected to Governor Jay Pritzker's limit of 10 worshipers of religious services. Before the court acted, Pritzker modified the restriction to allow for up to 100 people at a time. There were no recorded dissents. Now, what we see here is a unashamed, unambiguous, and revolting assault on the United States First Amendment right to worship as you see fit. And this is something that is going to get worse as time goes on because, quite frankly, the United States and indeed the world as a whole is getting more and more of a disdain for the Judeo-Christian ethic, the Judeo-Christian God whose name is Jehovah, and so on and so forth. And we are going to start seeing, I don't know how bad it'll necessarily get in my lifetime, but we are certainly going to start seeing more and more, whether it's in the media with insulting it, whether it's in the law with making sure that they don't have the rights they had in the past. We will probably end up seeing, churches taxed here in the near future. We'll probably end up seeing churches forced to comply with certain preaching guidelines here in the near future, certain gender and racial guidelines as far as how many people you have to have, right? Like affirmative action, have to have a female pastor, have to have a certain amount of black deacons, so on and so forth, right? We're probably going to end up seeing a lot of stuff like this coming here in the near future, where the state just encroaches more and more on the liberties of churches and on the liberties of individual church parishioners. And your conservative justices, quote unquote, and your conservative politicians will be of no help to you. And I say that with a heavy heart, but unfortunately it's true. The Republican Party, or Republican Party as Jesse Ventura used to call it, and the Democrat Party, or the Democrat Party as Jesse Ventura used to call it, are not interested in the liberties or in the prosperity even of their constituents. What they're interested in is power and their own personal political agenda. And a lot of times that personal political agenda is nothing more than keeping political power. I mean, in a lot of instances, you do have people who their opinions shift constantly simply because they want to be the ones making decisions. And so they stay in politics for 40, 50, 60 years, despite the fact that they've never had a consistent thought in their entire life. And of course, sometimes they do have a consistent thought in their entire life and stay for 40 or 60 years, and they still end up trashing it anyway because humans are perpetually terrible at everything. Unfortunately, this is not the only time the court system has failed us. I already went on the rants that I did, and it's not the only time that the court system will fail us. In fact, it's going to fail us more and more and more as time goes on. You recall I was pleasantly surprised by their unwillingness to hear the Free the Nipple case from New Hampshire. The reason that it was a surprise for me in the first place is because I figured they would hear it and rule in favor of the protesters, because they constantly rule in favor of wickedness and anti-constitutional government authority. But, lo and behold, sometimes you win, sometimes you lose. The Lord giveth and the Lord taketh away. Blessed be the name of the Lord, as Job says. And unfortunately, we just kind of have to deal with the fact that this is where we are at in American history. The Supreme Court has stated that the government has the right to shut down your business, or shut down your church, rather, and tell you how many people you can or cannot have in that church, simply because what it perceives as a public safety issue. And by the way, it was a perception of public safety. We have seen now beyond any shadow of a doubt, that the COVID crisis was absolutely overblown. It was impossible that we were ever going to have millions dead. Even if you give multiple cycles, it still would never have happened. And of course, that doesn't really matter in this instance. We still get to shut down your churches. Anyways, thus saith the Supreme Court. Go back to the riots for a minute. Got to talk about that. There's a lot of stuff to be talking about here. NBC News, Trump says he will deploy military if state officials can't contain protest violence. You heard that correctly. Trump says he will deploy the military if state officials can't contain protest violence, because everything is terrible all the time for every reason. The president said he was an ally of all peaceful protesters as police and the National Guard forced protesters away from the White House. I don't know that that's necessarily accurate, but whatever floats your boat, Mr. Trump. As sirens wailed and flashbang grenades popped across the streets, President Donald Trump announced from the Rose Garden that he would use the U.S. military to stop the riots across the country that have been sparked by the death of George Floyd. Quote, I am mobilizing all available federal resources, civilian and military, to stop the rioting and looting, to end the destruction and arson, and to protect the rights of law-abiding Americans, including your Second Amendment rights, end quote. Which Trump literally threw the Second Amendment in there simply to rile up his base. I just think that needs to be pointed out because that is such a political pandering tool right there. And I say that as a Second Amendment supporter, by the way. Trump said in the extraordinary address, which was delivered as police fired smoke devices outside to push protesters back from the White House. Quote, we are ending the riots and lawlessness that has spread throughout our country. We will end it now, end quote, Trump said. Trump said that governors should deploy the National Guard in great numbers so that they dominate the streets. Quote, if a city or state refuses to take the actions necessary to defend the life and property of their residents, then I will deploy the United States military. Let me say that again. I will deploy the United States military, says Trump, and quickly solve the problem for them, end quote. Trump said, referring to himself as, quote, your president of law and order and an ally of all peaceful protesters, end quote. He said he was already dispatching, quote, thousands and thousands of heavily armed soldiers, military personnel, and law enforcement officers, end quote, to Washington to stop the violence that has been a feature of the protests there. Shortly before he started to speak, about 20 minutes before Washington's 7 p.m. ET curfew, which ET stands for Eastern Time, U.S. Park Police and the National Guard had started using smoke and flashbangs to push away the large crowd of peaceful protesters outside. D.C. Mayor Muriel Bowser complained on Twitter that the move would, quote, make the job of the D.C. Police Department officers more difficult, end quote. It soon became clear why the authorities forcibly cleared Lafayette Square and its surrounding street of peaceful protesters. This is the opinion of NBC News, I'd like to point out, is not necessarily the opinion of the Watchdog. Back to the article. Concluding his remarks, Trump said he was going to, quote, pay my respects to a very, very special place, end quote. Then, surrounded by many of his West Wing aides, he walked across the street that had been cleared in order to stand outside St. John's Episcopal Church, which suffered fire damage in protest Sunday night. Excuse me. Trump held up a Bible outside the church, posed for pictures, and then returned to the White House. He did not go in the church or express any religious sentiments there. And by the way, just for the record, because I do definitely disagree with a lot of the liberal attacks on Trump, but it does need to be pointed out this was definitely a photo op. He didn't pray. He didn't pay his respects to God or, speak the name of Jesus Christ or ask for repentance or anything like that. He didn't read from any verses of the Bible. He didn't go into the church. He just stood outside, held up a Bible, and had pictures taken. So, that is what that is. I think that was a little bit, like I said, pandering. I mean, that's really all you can say about it, right? It's pandering to his base for sure. I do definitely appreciate the sentiment, which is that we are not going to allow these historic monuments and also our churches be burned down to the ground by thugs who don't actually seem to have any political ideology whatsoever. I definitely appreciate that. I do not appreciate using Christ and using the Bible as a political prop at all. I just absolutely do not. I also really don't like this idea of using the National Guard in these protests. I understand why people want to. I get it. It's what do you do in this situation is the question. And I get that. And there is precedent absolutely for using the army against your own citizens. And I'm not here speaking only about the United States Civil War, but, in instances like when the Ku Klux Klan would attack voting booths and lynch black people in the 1870s and things like that, right? That was a precedent used there. And, of course, the great libertarian-in-chief, if you will, Thomas Jefferson, writer of the Declaration of Independence and one of the many minds that crafted the U.S. Constitution, though the primary one is James Madison, he's actually the one who passed the Insurgent Act originally, right? So it's not as if this is something that, is only done by people who are evil and want to just oppress people and, use their tyrannical will and smash all their little political enemies and so on and so forth. That being said, I think that if you just simply used the police to go after the protesters who were being violent rather than sitting back and doing nothing, right, then the peaceful protesters would still be able to continue what they're doing. People who were not, having anything to do with this would still be able to continue doing what they're doing, and you wouldn't have to call the National Guard. You wouldn't have to get, any of these seriously ridiculous curfews or anything like that enacted. I don't like the idea of curfews at all. I got to be honest with you. People have been standing around outside and are being shot by metal bullets, or are sitting on their own porches and are being shot by rubber bullets, not metal bullets, sorry, rubber bullets, and that's unacceptable. That's unacceptable in my opinion. And if you're saying, yeah, but that's acceptable because of everything that the rioters are doing, well, that's the exact same argument. That's the exact same argument that the rioters are currently using right now to justify their rioting. They're saying, well, George Floyd was murdered by police, which is true, right? That is an actual grievance of an actual moral evil committed by the Minneapolis Police Department, specifically Derek Chauvin, right? So that's true, and that is their excuse to riot and attack people who had nothing to do with it. Likewise, you're looking at the riot, which once again, true, they are rioting and attacking people who had nothing to do with it, looting, causing chaos, all of that sort of stuff, and you're saying as a result of that, I'm going to restrict everybody's liberties. I'm going to start shooting people who are being peaceful, even if it is only with rubber bullets, and so on and so forth, right? So the logic the United States is using right now, and the many states are using right now is the exact same logic that is being used to justify the violent protests in the first place, right? And in both instances, once again, the problem is you move past the people who had something to do with it and start encroaching on the rights of innocent civilians, right? When you shoot with a rubber bullet, even if it is just a rubber bullet, when you shoot people who are just standing outside simply because it's past 7 p.m., right? That is an encroachment on people's liberties. When you shoot people who are recording you simply because they are recording you, even though they're on their own property, okay, that is an encroachment on American civil liberties. Innocent people who are not doing anything. Just like it is an encroachment on your civil liberties when people go into the AutoZone and burn it down, or when people beat the hell out of a guy for having the audacity to defend his store or what have you. They are both equally evil. Equally evil. Okay, and I know I started this off by saying these situations are complicated, and they are. I understand they are. I understand there needs to be a certain level of nuance and grace, and may the Lord help us all. But we also need to call out evil when evil occurs. Racism in all of its forms, whether it's black on white racism or white on black racism, is evil. Police brutality and government overreach and tyranny is evil. Police and national guardsmen taking away people's liberties and shooting at people because they are out past a certain point of time at night is evil. Looting rather, and rioting and so on and so forth is evil, right? There is no good sides in this situation. Everybody is consistently acting evil, and of course that is the problem that I am trying to stress to people. When you have no good guys, you just devolve into absolute chaos, okay? And we need to return to a time of good guys. We need to return to a time of actually having respect for our traditions, respect for our Constitution, for the rule of law, for the liberties of individual human beings, right? Mostly for respect for God. And by God, I mean the Judeo-Christian God whose name is Jehovah and his son Jesus Christ in particular. And I'm sorry if that offends you. Returning to the article, I can rant forever, and we're already past 50 minutes. The Right Reverend... I hate it when these guys give themselves these ridiculous titles. The Right Reverend. It's ridiculous. Anyways, the Right Reverend Marianne Budd, by the way, women should not be pastoring the church, just saying. The Right Reverend Marianne Budd, Bishop of the Episcopal Diocese of Washington, who oversees the church, told the Washington Post that she found out about the visit when it was shown on television, and that she was outraged by what she saw. She said, quote, she was not given even a courtesy call that they would be clearing with tear gas so they could use one of our churches as a prop, holding a Bible, one that declares that God is love, and when everything he has said and done is to inflame violence, end quote. Democrats blasted the move as well. Quote, the desire for a certain backdrop for a press announcement is not a security requirement, end quote. Senator Brian Schultz, a Democrat from Hawaii, tweeted. Quote, in other words, using the power of the United States military to clear out peaceful protesters for oppressor is a massive abuse of power, end quote. Senator Kamala Harris, a Democrat from California, was more succinct. Quote, Donald Trump just tear-gassed peaceful protesters for a photo op, end quote. She tweeted. New York Governor Andrew Cuomo called the decision shameful. Somebody probably out there, why are you calling him a murderer? Well, I don't know. I mean, he just forced old folks' homes to take people who were sick with COVID. But, you know, whatever. Anyways, his tweet said the president is calling out the American military against American citizens. He used the military to push out a peaceful protest so he could have a photo op at a church. It's all just reality TV show for this president. Shameful. And again, I don't necessarily disagree with this sentiment. I do agree that it's a tough situation and what are you to do? But remember again that 4 of those states that seceded in the United States Civil War seceded not because the United States government was going to take away their slaves, but because they felt the United States government was overstepping its bounds when they went after the 7 states that seceded due to slavery. They thought it was unjust to invade and kill your fellow countrymen. And Donald Trump absolutely runs that risk right now of people who don't support Black Lives Matter and maybe don't even think there's a police brutality issue, actually deciding that they have a problem with this now that Trump is deciding to call in the military and troops. I don't necessarily have better plans, I guess. I think the cops should have been able to handle it. In a lot of these instances, the cops just simply weren't doing anything, and I think that was a big problem. I know people say, well, like, there's so many people. How exactly are you going to solve the issue? Well, you tear gas them when they were being peaceful. I don't understand why you can't tear gas them when they're being violent. You know what I mean? But of course, the cops, like every other branch of government, are perpetually useless at everything all the time for every reason. I gotta get a shirt that says that. Anyways, asked whether the area was cleared to accommodate Trump's visit to the outside of the church, White House Deputy Press Secretary Judd Deere said, quote, the perimeter was expanded to help enforce the 7 p.m. curfew in the same area where rioters attempted to burn down one of our nation's most historic churches the night before. Protesters were given these warnings by the U.S. Park Police, end quote. And by the way, that is another thing that I absolutely disagree with, right? And that's why I keep saying there isn't really any just side here. What was the point of burning down the church? What's the point of vandalizing the Washington Monument or the Lincoln Memorial or anything like that, right? What's the point? What does this accomplish, right? Especially something like the Lincoln Memorial, which is dedicated to somebody who quite literally split the country in half because of his attempts to free African American people from their bondage, right? Love tea. If you guys like tea, it's technically an herbal tea. It's not a traditional tea, but lemon ginger, man. Lemon ginger with honey. Flame-o! Anyways. To activate the military to operate in the U.S., Trump would have to invoke the 213-year-old Insurrection Act, which 4 people familiar with the decision had told NBC News he planned to do. Very scary stuff. The military police forces would come from Fort Bragg, North Carolina, and possibly Fort Belvoir, Virginia, and they could arrive in Washington within hours, these people said. The chair of the House Armed Services Committee, Representative Adam Smith, a Democrat from Washington, urged Trump to reverse course. Quote, the domestic deployment of our armed forces is an incredibly serious undertaking that should not be taken lightly, end quote, Smith said. Quote, we live in a democracy, not a dictatorship, end quote. He added, urging Trump to use the powers of the presidency, quote, to calm tensions across the country and not escalate them, end quote. And I have to completely agree. As much as I hate agreeing with liberals and members of the Democratic Party, I think that is absolutely correct. I don't think that this is going to help anything. I think it's definitely going to fan the flames and make everything a heck of a lot worse, especially when you have the National Guard doing the dastardly things that they're doing, like putting rubber bullets in people's chests for standing around or for having the audacity to sit on their own damn porch on their own property. You know what I mean? That's not acceptable. There's a lot of people who think it's not acceptable. They will not accept it in a lot of instances. And this situation could get way more violent than it is. Okay? As bad as things are, they're actually relatively benign, all things considered, right? When you consider the violence that took place during the Yellow Jacket protests, or let's get worse, when you consider the violence that took place during the Arab Spring, or let's get worse, when you consider the violence that took place in the 1870 attacks by the Ku Klux Klan, or let's get worse, the Cold Wars, or let's get worse, the American Civil War, right? How bad can it get? It can get bad. It can continue escalating. There's worse than the U.S. Civil War. There's the Syrian Civil War. There's worse than that. There's World War II. There's worse than that. There's the 100 Years' War, right? We can move on and 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 on up the scale to eventually Armageddon, right? It can always get worse. And this situation is escalating right in front of our eyes, basically by the hour, right? And nobody's helping it. Conservatives aren't helping it. Liberals aren't helping it. The government isn't helping it. The protesters aren't helping it. The rioters aren't helping it. Nobody is helping the situation at all. And I fear for the country. I really do. Trump's decision on whether to invoke the act adopted in 1807 to deploy more troops has come as his frustrations mount over the protests that have followed the death of Floyd, a black man who died in police custody in last week in Minneapolis. The people familiar with his decision said Trump was angry Sunday night at the destruction some protesters caused in Washington, particularly the vandalizing of national monuments. Some of the president's aides have been encouraging him for days now to invoke the act as he weighed options to exercise executive powers to address the crisis. The act was invoked during the 1992 riots over the police beating of Rodney King. Trump's remarks come hours after he urged the nation's governors to get tough with unruly demonstrators. Quote, most of you were weak. He told them, according to an audio call obtained by NBC News, you have to dominate. If you don't dominate, you're wasting your time. They're going to run you over. You're going to look like a bunch of jerks, end quote, the president said. At a briefing with reporters Monday, White House Press Secretary, I think it's Kaylee, I don't know if it's Kaylee or Kayla, but I'm going to go with Kaylee McEnany. I don't really know much about her. I apologize. I think the president's press secretaries and press briefings are just a joke, but nonetheless. Had left open the possibility that the president could invoke the Insurrection Act. Quote, the Insurrection Act is one of the tools available. Whether the president decides to pursue that, that is his prerogative, McEnany said. Governors can ask the federal government to send active duty troops to help in cases of civil unrest like the widespread protests plaguing cities over the last several days, but so far no governor has requested active duty troops to assist. Instead, they have relied on local law enforcement and National Guard soldiers and airmen on state active duty. Governors often prefer the National Guard forces in these cases because they can legally perform law enforcement duties in the U.S., whereas troops on active duty cannot without violating the Posse Comitatus Act, an 1878 law that prohibits the government from using military forces to act as a police force within the U.S. borders. But the president could invoke the Insurrection Act to deploy active duty forces without a request from a governor. Those troops would be allowed to conduct law enforcement missions. To invoke the act, Trump would first have to issue a proclamation to, quote, immediately order the insurgents to disperse and retire peaceably to their abodes within a limited time, end quote, according to the law, which he has not done yet. Quote, in the past, the Justice Department has drafted such proclamations, and according to the Congressional Research Service, the act has been invoked many times throughout U.S. history, although rarely since the 1960s Civil Rights era, which is fairly accurate. Ulysses Grant enacted the law like 3 or 4 times, which, of course, you know, there's a lot of argument about the necessity of that, but the Ku Klux Klan in the 1870s was certainly a massive problem, so, you know, it wasn't without reason for sure. When it was invoked in 1992 during the Los Angeles riots, the move was requested by California Governor Pete Wilson, not invoked solely by President George H.W. Bush. Trump's Attorney General, William Barr, was Bush's Attorney General the last time that act was invoked, and he led the Justice Department response to the King beating. The Defense Department, declined to comment on the possibility that the president could invoke the act. One of Trump's allies outside the White House, Senator Tom Cotton, a Republican from Arkansas, urged Trump to invoke the Insurrection Act if necessary so U.S. troops can, quote, support our local law enforcement and ensure that the violence ends tonight, end quote. And once again, like I said, I don't like the enacting of that law. I think it has the potential to make everything much, much, much worse. And not just the potential, but indeed, I think it just outright will make everything much, much worse. But nonetheless, we have already gone over an hour, and that's the rest of our time. We're going to talk a lot more about the protests this coming Thursday, discussing things such as, the different protests across the country and their effects and what the National Guard is doing and so on and so forth. So I definitely thank you guys for watching this program here with us. If you like the program, of course, please do like and share, subscribe to TheCynicogue if you're interested in catching the Watchdog or our Unapologetics program, which is more related to Christian apologetics. We certainly appreciate it. You'll find links to all of the articles that we used here today in the description below, as well as the video of the very tragic, evil, disgusting, despicable, horrible shooting of Danny Shaver. If you want to check out any of our social media accounts, you certainly can do that, also using the links in the description below. We have the TheCynicogue on Minds, the TheCynicogue on BitChute, the TheCynicogue on Patreon, the American Cynic Party on Facebook, ACP Official on Gab, Terrestrial Earthbird on Twitter, and Cynic Thought on Instagram. So if you're interested in any of those, please do check them out. We greatly appreciate it. Like and share this video. Get the message out. Don't fall in line with all of these moronic people protesting, right? I mean, the rioters and all these moronic people calling for insurrection acts and things like that. Be your own independent thinker. Stay vigilant. And in the face of Armageddon, do not compromise. Shalom.